Here's an example where we're trying to evaluate inverse trig functions, sine inverse on this example. So how do we do it? How do we do inverse trig functions? Well, basically, let me show you by going to the notes. So these are the notes that I'm sending you. Inverse trig functions 8.3. So it's all about the unit circle. So basically the answer is it's about grabbing that unit circle and finding our values there on the unit circle. So let's do that. Let's go back to the question. So sine inverse of negative a half. So an inverse function is switching inputs and outputs. So in other words, we're saying that the sine, let me put it here, the sine of some angle equals negative a half. And down here we're saying the sine of some angle is negative 1. And down here we're saying the sine of some angle is positive 1. So an inverse function switches inputs and outputs. That I think you know. So for example, we could say the sine of pi over 6 is a half. This is the angle. This is the answer. So I could switch it and go sine inverse of a half, putting the answer here, equals pi over 6. The angle goes out there. So an inverse function, you remember, switches inputs and outputs, switches x and y, inputs and outputs. That's what an inverse function does. It inverts. It switches the positions. So therefore, when they're giving me, let's start with part C, this will be the easiest one. They're saying the sine of what angle is 1? That's what the inverse sine of 1 is really asking. The sine of what angle is 1? They want the angle whose sine is 1. Well, let's go look at the unit circle and try to find a sine whose answer, remember this is the answer, and we're looking for the angle. And remember on the unit circle, the sine values are the y values, right? Cosine are the x values, sine are the y values. So let's go to the unit circle, look at the sine and find the y values and find +1 as an answer and bring back the angle. So looking at the unit circle, remember it's cosine sine, cosine sine, cosine sine. Well, there it is. There is a sine of 1. So the angle is pi over 2. So there we go. There's the answer to that one. So this one's pi over 2. Now, let's try the other ones. How about, let's do negative 1. Let's do that one. Sine inverse of negative 1. So again, we're looking for an answer. They're giving us an answer of negative 1, and we're trying to find the angle that goes with that on the unit circle. So where in the unit circle is there an answer of negative 1? Let's see. Answer in negative 1, cosine sine, right there, 3 pi over 2. But hold on. Here's where things get a little weird. All the angles here in this fourth quadrant, for the inverse trig functions, they're going to make us say them as negative. Let me show you. Here's a nice diagram of it. It's going to make us show them as negative. For inverse sine and inverse tangent, we can only use quadrants 1 and 4. And see how these ones are all made negative? Here, 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 and here becomes negative pi over 6, negative pi over 4, negative pi over 3, and negative pi over 2. So this one becomes negative pi over 2. In other words, it's the same as this one, which is positive pi over 2, but it's negative pi over 2. So they're making us say the answers in the fourth quadrant with negative answers. It's the same spot. If they told me, I want you to find negative 90 degrees. This is 0 right here. And negative angles go down, so this spot right here is definitely negative 90 degrees. It's also positive 270. Those are two ways of referring to the exact same spot. And in radians, you can say it's positive 3 pi over 2 or negative pi over 2. right? Because that's negative 90. Remember, pi is 180. So 180 over 2, that's negative 90. So it's negative pi over 2 or negative 90, but it can also be said as positive 3 pi over 2 or positive 270 if you want to list it as a positive angle. Either way, this same spot can be set as a negative angle or a positive angle. Any spot here, like this spot, can be set as a positive angle or as a negative angle, right? Positive if you go upwards at first, negative if you go downwards at first. It's the same spot. So any angle on the unit circle can be set as a positive or negative angle. Well, when we do inverse trig functions, they specifically want us to say the answers here in the fourth quadrant, those four spots, as negative angles, not positive. So you have to remember that. Quadrant 4 are changed to negative. So that's very important. Okay, so let's get back to it. So, where were we? We were here. And so that means negative 1, that was at negative pi over 2. That's the angle. And finally, last one, answer negative a half. What's the angle whose sign has an answer negative a half? Let's go look for the answer negative a half. So negative a half, I'm going to go back to the unit circle here. So negative a half, so remember it's cosine sine, cosine sine, cosine sine. There it is, sine negative a half. But wait a minute, here's another one right here. Notice we have two spots that have sine negative a half. And for most of the, I didn't say it before, but for most of these answers, you're going to have two spots. So which one's the right spot? They both have sine negative a half. So they're asking me sine inverse of negative a half. They're giving me the answer negative a half, and they want me to give the angle. What angle? Well, here's the other part of these notes. They only want one answer. Only one answer, or one angle, I should say. One angle only. How do you know what angle? Well, for sine inverse and tangent inverse, notice this arrow, they only use the right two quadrants, quadrants 1 and 4. We don't use this quadrant, we don't use that quadrant for sine inverse and tangent inverse. Cosine inverse, we only use the top two quadrants, but we're not doing that right now. So sine inverse and tangent inverse, the right two quadrants only. And so the quadrants 1 and 4 only. And in quadrant 4, remember, we use negative angles. So we're only using this answer right here. We're not using that one. Only these two quadrants for sine inverse and for tangent inverse. And we can't say it as 11 pi over 6. Remember, we have to say it as a negative angle. What negative angle? Well, it's negative the same amount that is positive. That's positive pi over 6. Well, then this must be negative pi over 6. That's how we say 11 pi over 6 as a negative angle. It's negative the same amount this one was positive. So negative pi over 6. That's our answer to that question. Negative pi over 6.